Now I am going to stand, and on these heels no less, so if I'm still standing by the end, that's a good thing. So given the calibre of the experts in their field that we've had today, this might not instill in you endless confidence in my right to be here, but I'm going to start off by telling you about something I don't understand. We've all heard the saying, the grass is greener on the other side, but this makes little sense to me. If we buy into this premise, then the very people you are envying on this elusive other side must by definition be envying you. So why can't we skip the part where everyone's envious of each other and get to being appreciative for what we have? And then recently I heard another saying that resonates more fully with me, and that's that the grass is greener where you water it, because it implies that attitude is key. When I was thinking about what I wanted to share, I realised that I wanted to share why I believe an open-minded attitude is key. And I thought about it in terms of culture, because I've spent most of my life overseas, in gender, because I'm a female. But it's more than that. We have to be open-minded to age, disability, sexuality, success, choices. And so this term is bandied about with little clarity as to what it actually entails. But today I hope to give you 3 ways you can incorporate an open-minded attitude into your daily life, regardless of profession or ethnicity. Now I know it's late in the afternoon, so I'm going to, if you remember nothing else from what I'm about to say, I'm going to get you to remember 4 words. Yes, no, maybe so. We've got to start saying yes at an individual level to opportunities that present themselves and loving yourself and others, as we've just heard. We've got to say no to closed-minded stereotypes of success and undervaluing ourselves. And we've got to say maybe so when decision-making so that we evaluate all alternatives without blindly forging ahead with the yes or no answer. If we can become open-minded in this way in terms of self as women or men, and at a societal level, we can work towards the empowerment of all. So we've got to start by saying yes to opportunities as they present themselves. Because there exists a dichotomy between people who attribute outcomes to luck and those who believe we create our own luck. But Dr. Stephen Macri and his team recently found that those who we believe are lucky are not that way by accident. They're actually just better at seeing an opportunity was being presented to them and seizing that opportunity and taking action. So we've got to be open-minded enough to say yes when opportunities are presented. Because the journalist recently asked a wide range of women, when did you start falling in love with yourself? And the median age was 36. Now, I'm sure we know a lot of men who we think are a little too in love with themselves, but men too suffer from this, and we perennially underestimate ourselves. And so by taking the steps we just heard, but also by saying yes to opportunities, we learn quicker what's right and what's wrong for us, and hopefully fall in love with ourselves sooner than 36. This same attitude applies to looking at gender and cultural differences. If we stereotype people too soon, we don't allow them the opportunity to become empowered, but we also don't know what opportunities they will afford us. By continuing to say yes to opportunities, we can also prolong this empowerment. Having been to a lot of 21st in the last few years, you often hear something said, and some of you might be guilty of saying it, it all goes downhill from here. Now, whilst I'm okay for certain things to go downhill as I age, I'm not okay for my life to. And so by saying yes to opportunities, we become empowered sooner, but also stay empowered longer. Now, this might sound like a feel-good concept, and that's important too, but there are very real consequences for not falling in love with ourselves sooner. And as women, or when approaching women's issues, we have to say no to unattainable levels of success and no to undervaluing our self-worth. Because consultant Lisa Gates found that in her research, men initiate pay rise negotiations in the workplace at 4 times the rate of women, and when we do choose to negotiate, we ask for, and thus get, 30% less on average. As Cassie White explains, what we feel people that are paid more matter more in the corporate world. And so therefore, not only does the pay gap reflect a culture in which we undervalue our self-worth, we are then being perceived as being worth less because of this pay gap, which results in a vicious cycle very hard to break out of. So by not being open-minded as to how we define our self-worth, we engender, pun intended, it's late in the afternoon, guys, come on, we engender the pay gap we campaign so furiously against. But also by not being open-minded to how we define success, we prevent ourselves from becoming empowered. We've all seen it, the headlines that read, women can't have it all, or how you can have it all in the self-help sections. Women in society put so much pressure on ourselves to maintain the perfect figure, family, career, relationships, but it's not possible. Or if it is, tell me how, because I started university and got in a relationship 4 years ago and I've since put on 15 kilos. But I'll tell you why I don't think it's possible. You're never told as a kid you can have all the candy in the store. In China, they have beautiful green grass around parks and monuments, but this is because you're not allowed to sit on the grass. So people sit on the pavement admiring the green grass. So life is about trade-offs, right? We're always told that. And so I believe as women, and this might be contentious, but we should aim to have what we want the most, not to have it all. Our problem with prioritising lies in part because we have more choices than men. Apart from the fact that I don't think any of the men here had to deal with the choice to get in the shower and get into incredibly weird situations to shave the back of their legs this morning. Men also, for example, can't choose to have children. But do you think any of the men in your lives or any of the men here would rate themselves as failures because they can't give birth? So as women, our version of having it all is broader than a male's. But there's only 24 hours in a day for both genders, last time I checked. So we have to make those hard choices. But we have to be open-minded not only to making the choices, but to the choices others make. Alain de Botton echoes this sentiment where he says that any measure of success has to admit where you are losing out. But we've got to be content with this. We see this pressure on women to have it all so often because we scoff at stay-at-home mums while simultaneously pitying women who prioritise their careers. If we can't have what we prioritise, that's a problem. But we've got to be open-minded to the different priorities people might have so that we allow ourselves and others to feel empowered because we achieved what we wanted the most. Finally, we have to be open-minded to people, policy, decision-making by saying maybe so when problem-solving so that we evaluate all alternatives before saying yes or no. It's a small irony that we come up with policies for multiculturalism and gender equality that are often drafted by elderly white men from one political party. No offence to any such men here. But does this take into account varying viewpoints? Indeed, it doesn't even take into account the viewpoints of those it's claiming to help. And by taking those into account, we might find that we change the decision we came to. So for effective decision-making, we need to have an open-minded attitude. I give the trivial example of a girl I overheard in the jewellery shop Diva, and that should have been my first clue, but don't hold it against me, who was talking about her gap year. And she said, I want to go and experience the developing world and see what life's like in a third world country. And then she said she was going to the far-flung nation of Singapore. Now, had she spoken to any Singaporeans or done any research at all, she might have realised she was better off staying in Brisbane for her third world experience. But she made a flawed decision because she didn't take into account all the information available and painted all of Asia with a developing brush without being open-minded to diversity. So problems occur because we don't actively seek to be inclusive. Our brain's lazy, which is why we have so much theory about how to be better listeners and communicators to overcome these cognitive biases and stereotypes. I found an article about communication with hedgehogs the other day, but whatever floats your boat. But there's rarely any mention as to the need to increase the number of people we're listening to. And to be truly open-minded, we need to listen to the quiet ones or those that don't have a voice. This has never been a problem for me. My whole life I've been known for how much I talk, and you best believe I'm going to use my 15 minutes today. In primary school, I got straight A's on my report card, apart from that one box that always wrecked everything, works independently when necessary. In high school, I was rewarded for speaking up, and at university. And another thing helped me in this regard. I've always had a very loud voice. And so it got you all sitting up a bit, right? Even if other people were talking, I talked louder. But as Susan Cain said in her TED Talk, there's zero correlation between being the best talker and having the best ideas. And as much as it pains me to admit it, she's right. In fact, they might have better ideas because while I'm too busy talking or thinking about when I get to talk next, they're probably catching more of the mistakes. Evidence of this bias in policy negotiation is so evident where by design or by consequence, they often exclude the other side of the story. I recently completed a research study on the Global Compact, which is a United Nations initiative that aims to increase sustainable development by assimilating workplaces with UN goals. And it does so through signing up companies to 10 principles. I wanted to analyse how it's affected the lives of women in the companies that sign on, as gender equality is such a big focus in the Millennium Development Goals and such like. Being a uni student, I procrastinated. And I even went to meetings with my supervisor saying, it's definitely helping these women. I've definitely found that. You can imagine my surprise when 2 weeks before it was due, I went to the website for the first time and found that not one of the principles relate to gender equality, even though it's such a pervasive problem across industries and across cultures. And when I looked at the dialogue around this, it pointed to the fact that women's advisory bodies were not in the drafting or the monitoring process. So it led to a flawed outcome because we weren't inclusive. This opinion of women as unimportant in an organisational sense isn't new. I was reading a Chinese novel written in the 14th century recently, and this line's English translation is, "Brothers are like limbs, wives are like clothing. Torn clothing can be repaired, but how can limbs be mended?" But before you think that we must have come a long way since the 14th century, we just have a current, more eloquent version, bros before hoes. But it's now believed that women are the drivers of sustainable development. So any policy that aims to achieve this but doesn't allow for the betterment of their situation in the workplace will ultimately fail. So policies won't work if they're not inclusive, but they also won't help those that we sought to empower. Education levels for girls in some Pacific countries are very low, and governments and NGOs have tried to change this, but assuming it's because girls are less valued than their male counterparts or because they're playing household roles, which is not the whole problem. Women who live and work in the Pacific told me recently that the most dangerous time for a girl is on her way to school, and these girls were being raped on the walk to or from campus, so their families were trying to protect them. But that doesn't make it to the negotiation tables. These women don't have a voice, or they don't even have physical access to the deliberation on initiatives designed to help them. And so what ends up happening is an elite minority draft development documents to help the majority, and this doesn't work. But there are grassroots efforts by individuals who are working to change this, and I encourage us all to do this. I met a man called Antonio recently who's from El Salvador and is a tribal leader and works with the UN. But he's lived here and worked here for many years, and so he speaks the lingo. He helps other tribal groups format what they wish to present so it fits within the forum, and so their voices are being heard, and in the process they are becoming empowered. In our own way, by asking each member of our family their opinion on a crucial decision, or by asking the person who didn't say anything in the meeting what their opinion was, this sort of inclusion is possible, but also necessary if we want these things to work, but also if we want to empower people. Finally, we also have a tendency to see people only as victims when in fact they might have something to teach us. We've talked a lot about third world countries today and helping people, but I went to Cambodia and I built houses for families there and met women who had AIDS and were deserted by their family. But they still had to provide for their children. And so they went to this charity that I was building houses for and said, every house you build should have one of our quilts in it, which it now does. And so they were from a war-torn country, they were plagued by illness, but they were empowered in terms of work. Bill Clinton most recently highlighted that half the members of parliament in Rwanda are women. But when we think of Rwanda, it wouldn't often be in terms of how empowered the women there are. So we have to listen to stories, be inspired by the tenacity, and realise that people are going to be empowered in many different ways. I was reminded of this most recently with my sister when I said, I think she's a pessimist, and she's adamant she's a realist. I said, why don't you be more positive about things? Why don't you just be more positive? And she said, just because I don't phrase things in the same way as you doesn't mean I'm any less happy or content with the situation. And I sat back and thought about me writing this speech and thought, I'm such a fraud. I'm talking about being open-minded, but I'm imposing the way you should express your empowerment on someone else. And so we've got to be open-minded to all the ways in which people are empowered, not just the ways we think they should be. And this can only be achieved through dialogue, through actually talking to people and not just in the 160 characters allowed in something like Twitter. So before I finish, I want to get you all awake for the last two speakers. So if you could for me, please reach as high as you could to the ceiling. And now if we could just reach 2 inches higher. So everyone in this room just raised their hand a bit higher, even though the first request was to reach as high as you could. I was duped by it the first time I did it as well, but we can always try that little bit harder. Did you really ask everyone in your workplace their opinion on that new policy? Or did you personally reject an opportunity because you weren't open-minded as to your own abilities to seize it? We're here at TEDx to talk about not just possible or even probable, but preferred futures. And one way I believe we can bring about the preferred future of empowerment is by adopting an open-minded attitude. We've got to say yes to taking opportunities and loving yourself and others. Say no to setting unattainable levels of success and being closed-minded when valuing your self-worth, especially as women. And say maybe so when problem-solving so that we evaluate all alternatives. Because no one wants to live in a world where your grass is green but nobody else's is. And if we're not listening to all voices, we'll make flawed decisions that don't allow for the empowerment of all. So let's remember these steps. Yes, no, maybe so. And put in that extra effort to be open-minded. Because after all, the grass will be greener where we water it.